Hi there and welcome to a little review of the Nikon D4. As you may recall, I bought this camera back in 21 and now we're in April 23, and some of you have asked me, what do you think of the Nikon D4? Is it still a good camera and so on? And to answer it very briefly, I would say yes, it is a fantastic camera, but there are some things you should know. There are 3 major drawbacks of this camera that I will share with you. And then there are a few annoyances that I will also get into. And then there's one big advantage, or you can say the big thing about this camera, and that is the image quality, if you ask me. So let me get started with the drawbacks. So let me get started with the drawbacks. And the first drawback, you can maybe already see it here. It is the size and the weight of this animal. The camera body itself is 1.2 kilos and it just feels heavy. And when you then add a 70-200 that I got here, it's just a crazy weight. I was out driving the other day and I got so annoyed because my car keep telling me, you're not wearing a seatbelt. And I was like, I am. And I checked again and again. I had plugged it in. What happened was I put the camera next to me and the sensor, there's not only a sensor in the driver's seat, there's also a sensor in the passenger seat, and that sensor picked up that someone was sitting there. The camera here is that heavy. So be warned, if you don't like big cameras, if you don't like heavy cameras, there's no doubt in my mind you should stay clear of the Nikon D4. It is not for you. And I would also say, try it before you buy it. It is wonderful ergonomics, if you ask me, but it is designed, I would say, for a relatively big hand, and you may not like it. So we are very much into personal preference here. So give it a try, see what you think about it. Borrow one if you can and see how it works with you. It is so important. So make sure the ergonomics is you favor the ergonomics of this camera. I think it is one of the best cameras I've ever tried when it comes to ergonomics, but it is very, very much personal preference. And for a traveling camera, I would never bring the Nikon D4. The second big disadvantage of this camera is that even though there's no official record of it, the word on the street is that Nikon will give you 10 years of service on a camera. The D4 came out in 2012, and as we're in 23 now, it is very likely that the copy that you will get, if you get a D4 and not a D4S, that copy is no longer serviced by Nikon. That means if your camera has an issue, you need to change the shutter or whatever is the problem with the camera, I'm not sure the Nikon will actually service it. So be sure that you take this into consideration. I think you can only have it serviced in an unauthorized workshop, or buy the 4S, the Nikon 4S, the one that the D4S, the one that followed this camera. It is younger and still in service, and I think also when you compare the prices, you will be able to see that the D4S is, for that reason, I think, significantly more expensive than the D4 itself. But I would say this is pro-grade stuff. It will give you 400,000 clicks according to the spec sheet, and I'm pretty sure I will get even more than that out of this camera. And I think I'm currently at 150,000 or so, I can't even recall. But there's plenty of life in this camera for me, and I have a pretty good feeling that it will live. But you do take a chance, so factor that in before you buy your used copy of the Nikon D4. The third big area of big disadvantage with this camera is the video capabilities. You can tell that it is 10 years old now. I think today, if you're a hybrid shooter, you probably would expect to have 4K and a lot of other features and a lot of more computing power in general in the camera. And this camera doesn't have all that. It will do 1080. It will do it well, but in general, you can see the development around cameras or in cameras has been, you get better and better video specs and you get more and more computing power. And here you can really tell that the D4 is dated. So if you're planning to use this camera for hybrid shooting, yeah, I mean, your requirements for video may differ from mine, but I think this is really where you can see the camera is no longer a modern camera. Then I guess the good question is, with these three things out of the way, why would you then go for a Nikon D4? Well, the D4 was originally built for speed, and that may be one of your reasons for why you want to buy it. It is crazy fast. Both the autofocus system, but certainly also the buffer it has for storing images. When you have it on continuous high, it is, even by today's standard, I think you would say that it can move a lot of data really, really fast. So definitely for speed, you know, sports, wildlife, birds in flight, that stuff, it's an excellent camera. It is, however, not the reason why I bought it, which may be a little bit crazy when you think about it, but I bought it because the image quality is really, really good. And I will say the color rendition especially. I shoot Nikon D700, D750, Z6 Mark II. This camera has, of all the Nikons I've ever tried, this one has the best image quality, full stop. And you may say, yeah, Frederick, but it only has 16 megapixels. For my use, it is more than plenty. If you need more, of course, that's up to you. If you do heavy cropping or you do some specialized editing where you need a lot of resolution, you may have good arguments for why you need more resolution. I just don't. So I'm fine with that. I will say this camera and the image quality, some of the best I've ever seen, especially the colors. Another thing is that when you're at the beach, like I am very often, and you shoot in an environment like this, there's a lot of salt in the water, obviously, but also in the air. And that can be brutal to your camera, really brutal. And I can see some of my other cameras, they do survive, but I have a feeling that, you know, dust and salt and stuff like that somehow enters the camera. I can't prove it. I just think that the sensor gets dirty more quickly. With this one, I hardly ever clean the sensor. It seems to me like it has an extra level of being dust and waterproof. It's just so well built, and you can really tell this is a professional level camera. So when you go for a D4, you should of course be aware it is a DSLR, meaning there is a mirror flicking. So if you're dreaming of a camera that makes no noise or has no sound, then of course this is not the camera for you, because it is noisy, really noisy. And it is built for speed, and when you put it on continuous high, the noise is crazy. It sounds like a machine gun. So be aware that if you need to shoot silent, this is probably not the camera for you. Also, when I come back from a mirrorless camera to this one, there are a few things that I miss that I have gotten used to in the mirrorless world. And one of them is that you can move the focus point around to any point on the viewfinder. In this case here, you have to stay in the center. You have 51 points in the center, I believe, and you have to stay in that center. I know you can focus and recompose, but when you've gotten used to it on the mirrorless camera, you notice it when you come back to a DSLR. The other thing is that you don't have the ability to zoom in the viewfinder. You can zoom on the rear LCD on this one, but you can't zoom in the viewfinder. Another little detail that you may like from mirrorless that you have to get used to, that won't happen on a DSLR. And then focus peaking highlights. I'm really fond of that. I think, as you can hear, I shoot a lot with manual focus, and obviously focus peaking highlights is intended to help you with that. So that, in combination with the ability to zoom in the viewfinder, is really something I miss when I come back. I will say though, I'm always surprised how quickly I get used to the DSLR again. So for me, these are not big drawbacks. I just wanted to mention this in case you were flip-flopping back and forth between maybe an old DSLR and a modern mirrorless. As you can see, the D4 comes with what I would call a built-in battery grip. Normally, if I can say it like that, you buy your camera and then you buy a battery grip that you sort of mount at the bottom of the camera. But here it's baked into the camera. It's one big piece of camera body. And that is nice when you're shooting with it because it works really well, of course. But when you have to store it in a camera bag, I find this to be a little bit annoying that I can't take the bottom off because this camera is simply so big it won't fit into my camera bag. So on the D700 where I have a battery grip, I demount that and then the camera will fit nicely into my camera bag with a lens mounted. In this case, I have to take the lens off and sort of lie the camera down in order to make it fit into my camera bag. So it's just another dimension of the fact that the camera body here is not only heavy, it is also big. You can see the screen here. Maybe you have gotten used to an articulated screen, maybe even a fully articulating screen. Not in this case. It sits where it sits and it doesn't go anywhere unless you sort of start to violate your camera. It is not intended to move. It doesn't move. It just sits here. So if you were hoping to, flip a little bit up and down when you do high or low shots, that won't happen with this camera. It simply is not built for that. One little thing that this camera has that I think shows that it's a pro-grade camera is it has backlit buttons. So when you sort of switch on the camera and push it a little bit further, there's a sort of a spring-laden thing here. Then the buttons here become backlit, which when you shoot at night is a really nice thing. It's not a big thing, but I just think it goes to show that there's something a little bit extra about the Nikon D4. You can tell it is a pro-level camera. Speaking of differences between mirrorless and DSLRs, according to the spec sheet, this battery will last 2,600 shots. 2,600 shots. I mean, if you shoot in live view, obviously that won't happen. But if you shoot, just using the viewfinder, that is what you should expect. I've never shot 2,600 shots on one battery, but I do notice that the battery is extremely strong. It will last for a very long time. Actually, so long time that I sometimes forget to charge the battery or check how well charged it is. And even though it's only half full, I have plenty to go shooting a full day. So that is actually one of the nice things about DSLRs. They don't consume as much power because there isn't that many TV cameras in the camera to be powered up. You may be wondering why not the D4S, and I think that's a really good alternative to this camera. I have a blog post about that. I'll see if I can put a link to it somewhere here in the video. But the gist of it is two reasons. One is that I didn't really feel I had the need for the improvements that came with the D4S relative to the D4. The other reason was that the D4S was significantly more expensive than the D4. And I think this has to do with what I talked about just before, the fact that the D4S potentially is still within the service window that Nikon offers. And therefore you can have your camera serviced, and should something happen to it, you can have it fixed. And I know for many pros, they're willing to pay for that relative to a D4 that most likely you need to check the serial number to figure out exactly when it was produced. But most likely your Nikon D4 is no longer serviced by Nikon. Speaking of price and price differences, obviously this camera comes with 2 camera slots because it's a pro camera. But be aware that one of the 2 is an XQD card slot. And XQD never really caught on, as I understand it. So I think that is the reason why XQD cards are extremely expensive. It's actually only Sony and maybe one more, but at least Sony that makes them. So they are very, very expensive. So if the XQD card is not part of your deal, make sure you check out the price for an XQD card and add that to the price of your camera, because the XQD card can be, very expensive relative to the camera body. And I think you need to factor that in. So be aware of that, or make sure the XQD card is part of your deal. The camera has a lot of options for connections, physical connections that is. You can see you actually have the ability to put in local area network, and you can put in HDMI, not micro, but mini. And you have connectors for headphones and for microphones and so on and so forth. So it's pretty well equipped when it comes to physical connections. But of course, because it is so old, if you're used to Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or stuff like that, you won't find that in this camera. And again, this is where it shows that this camera is 10 years old. Yeah, so that's my 2 cents about the Nikon D4. I hope this was useful. My best advice for you if you're going to buy one of these cameras or you're considering to buy one of these is 2 things. One is try before you buy, because ergonomics is so important. And if you can't try it, make sure you can return the camera. Many of us buy gear online, and I would say if you buy at a professional like MPB, I'm not sponsored by them, but if you do, you can return the goods because you are a consumer dealing with a professional. So typically you will have a very good position in terms of being able to return the goods. Whereas on eBay, you often see that it's consumer to consumer, so when the deal is done, it can't go back. So it's more complicated. So if you can't try the camera before you buy, make sure you can return it. That's super important, otherwise you may end up with a camera that is no good to you. The other thing is that don't trust any single source, meaning this review either. Don't trust what I'm saying. Trust your own judgment and consult many different sources. That's my best advice. Read as many reviews as you can, watch as many reviews as you can, see as many videos as you can about the Nikon D4 and the Nikon D4S and what alternatives you're considering. Use as many sources as you can and sort of put together your own picture, because you're the only one who knows what's important for you. I don't know if speed is important for you. Maybe it's not. It's not important for me. But if speed is important, this could really put this camera on your short list. Whereas if speed is not important, but maybe weight is very important, then this camera is absolutely horrible. So all of these things, how the parameters are important for you, you're the only one who knows that. So make sure you make that little list of what's important for you, and also that you don't trust one source, but you consult as many sources as possible. I hope this was useful. As always, happy shooting. Take care. Bye-bye.